this is work that I've been doing for a number of years now with the economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998. And it's work that is an attempt to provide an ethical foundation for international development policy. But I keep doing work on the more philosophical side of it, trying to think about what social justice has to say about this approach. And so right now, I've recently been writing a general book, which is a kind of summary, but also restatement with a lot of new stuff on this approach. So in short, it's an ongoing philosophical project, and I just want to give you an idea of it. Some of you may know about it already, and then I hope to have lots of questions and challenges about it. So all over the world, people who are deprived are struggling for a full and meaningful human life, a life that's worthy of their human dignity. Countries and states within countries often chart their achievements in terms of economic growth alone, but people, meanwhile, usually are looking for something about their own lives and what they're actually able to do and be in their lives. So they need theoretical approaches that can be the ally of their struggles, not approaches that obscure what they're striving for. The late Mahbub-ul-Haq, who was a great Pakistani economist who founded what are now called the Human Development Reports of the United Nations Development Program, wrote in the first of those reports in 1990, "The real wealth of a nation is its people, and the purpose of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. This simple but powerful truth is too often forgotten in the pursuit of material and financial wealth," end quote. Well, let me give you an example that comes from my experience working with women's development groups in India. Consider then Vasanti, who's a woman in her 30s in the Indian state of Gujarat in northwestern India. Vasanti's husband was a gambler and an alcoholic. He used the household money to get drunk, and when that money ran out, he took the cash payment for vasectomy that was being offered by the state as part of its population policy. So the result was that Vasanti didn't even have any children to help her out around the house, and she was unusually burdened. And as her husband drank more and more, he became more and more abusive, became physically violent, and she felt that she could no longer live with him. She wanted to leave, but then the question is, could she leave? And this is a terrible dilemma for many women in abusive marriages in all countries of the world. Well, it happened that her birth family was willing to take her back. That's not always the case, but her father, who used to make Singer sewing machine parts, had died, but her brothers were running an auto parts shop in what used to be the father's shop, and so they said, you can sleep on the floor of the shop, and we'll even give you one of the father's machines. And so she was able to earn a very small income making the eyelets for the hooks on sari tops. Well, that was insecure because she still couldn't even get a divorce. She had to take a loan from her brothers to pay the lawyer to try to get the divorce, and so on. And she finally got, through the loan from the brothers, another machine, the one that rolls the silk on the edges of the sari, but she was dependent on her brothers, and so that was an insecure source of livelihood. They were married and had children, might have to come up with dowry, so they might not want to support a poor relation much longer. So then she went, and she was very lucky because one of the best women's non-governmental organizations in the world was right in her backyard. She went to the Self-Employed Women's Association, known as SEVA, run by the great activist Ela Bhatt, who last year was honored by this university with the Benton Medal for Public Service, first non-American to be so honored. Well, she went to SEVA, and she got a bank loan of her own and paid back her brothers. And by the time I met her, she had paid back almost all of the bank loan and even had 2 small savings accounts in the all-women's bank that SEVA runs. She also had enrolled in SEVA's educational programs, where she was learning for the first time in her life to read and write, and was beginning to acquire skills that would promote greater independence and other employment opportunities. Now, what theoretical approach could direct attention to the salient features of Vasanti's situation, promote an adequate analysis of it, and make pertinent recommendations for action? Such an approach, as you can already see, would need to focus on things such as basic education, health, bodily integrity, opportunities for employment, opportunities for political participation, and more generally, the importance of some degree of meaningful freedom to shape and fashion her own life. But the dominant theoretical approaches in development economics for a very long time, approaches that are still used all over the world, are not the allies of her struggle because they don't have an adequate conception of the human goal. They simply equate a region or nations doing well with increase in GDP per capita. In other words, Gujarat is pursuing the right policies for its people just in case its economy is growing. And of course, often that doesn't even translate into greater money per household because the way that the growth occurs is through foreign investment. A lot of the profits are repatriated by the foreign investor. So even as a measure of resources around in Gujarat, it's not a very good one. So even if we want then an average member, an average measure that is a single number, it's far from obvious that average GDP is the right number. In fact, the recent report on development and quality of life by what's known as the Sarkozy Commission, the Commission of Economists and other development people convened by President of France, that has written a really quite wonderful report on these things, says that, look, if you want a single number, average household income would be a more revealing number than average GDP. But furthermore, any crude single number tells us really nothing about distribution. So it can give high marks to nations or regions that contain alarming inequalities. In the old days, in the lists of developing countries, South Africa used to shoot very quickly to the top because, of course, there were a lot of resources around in South Africa, never mind that a very tiny part of the population had access to them, and a large majority were really quite unable to enjoy the fruits of the nation's prosperity. So too in Vasanti's case. Gujarat is a rich state, but the benefits of its foreign investment-related policies do not reach the poor, particularly the rural poor, and they particularly don't reach women because often men control whatever income does arrive in the household. So the standard approaches don't direct our attention to the reasons for Vasanti's inability to enjoy the fruits of her region's general prosperity. Indeed, they actually distract attention from her problems. When Narendra Modi, the chief minister of Gujarat, campaigns for re-election, I get scores of emails every day from, I'm on their listservs, saying, Gujarat, the big development success, and it's all about these numbers. But of course, the inequalities are just simply ignored. Another shortcoming of approaches focused on economic growth is that even when distribution is factored in, they fail to direct attention to aspects of the quality of a human life that are not very well correlated with growth, even if you did factor distribution in. Research shows clearly that promoting economic growth does not automatically trickle out, so to speak, to promote adequate health care and adequate education. Those two areas, there's particularly a large amount of empirical evidence that growth is not correlated with improvement in those two areas. And of course, political liberties is another case where we know that nations can grow very nicely and not deliver those goods. Evidence of that kind of independence is given particularly nicely in a study that Sen and his co-author Jean Drèze did of the different Indian states, because they control health and education at the state level. And so it's a nice kind of experimental laboratory about how different economic policies, different educational and health policies factor in and influence each other. And they found dramatic evidence that for the states that worked to promote growth really didn't deliver the goods in health and education, and other poorer states whose economy had not grown well because of their independent educational and health policies did do well. So that's another problem. And Kerala is a very interesting case, a southern Indian state which has very good educational achievements, 99% literacy among adolescents for both boys and girls, as against a background of 65% male literacy and 50% female literacy in the nation as a whole, so stunningly above the national average. And in health, too, it's stunningly above the national average. It has the same health data as Harlem in New York. Now that's bad for New York, but it's quite good for a poor Indian state, and much better, again, than the national average. So Kerala did that without actually having much economic growth because its economic policies had been a failure. So, in short, if we want to know how Vasanthi is doing in an insightful way, we need to ask lots of distinct questions. We need to determine what she's able to do and to be in quite a few different areas of human life. And the answer to this question simply is not present in the GDP number. How have her different circumstances, familial, social, political, affected her ability to enjoy good health, to protect her bodily integrity, to attain an adequate education, to work on terms of mutual respect and some degree of choice with other workers, to participate in politics, and so on. So development workers like to ask these questions. These are the questions that good non-governmental organizations ask all the time, but the dominant theoretical approaches were not asking them. And so what we give the name human capabilities to is these substantive opportunities, what people are actually able to do and to be in shaping their own lives in these different areas. Well, so as you already know by now, there's a new theoretical paradigm in the development world. It's known sometimes as the human development approach. That's what it's called in the UN reports. But Sen and I tend to call it the capabilities approach, and I attach particular importance to that because I use it as an approach to talk about animal welfare as well. So it's not just about humans. And this approach begins with a very simple question, which is, what are people actually able to do and be? And of course, that's simple in a way, but it's also complex because we insist from the start that the quality of a human life contains many components that are not the same, not commensurable by any single metric with one another. Now, this approach has had by now an increasing amount of influence in the UN development reports, in the Sarkozy Commission, and finally, and I like this particularly because you all could join in on this, in an association that's called the Human Development and Capability Association, which is an international association that anyone can join, anyone can submit a paper to its annual meeting. We have meetings, we have 700 members in 80 countries, but meetings all over the world, and most of the members are very young and are beginning work on this and join it in order to meet people from other countries who are interested in this approach, and so it's a very exciting thing to be at one of those meetings and see the interest of many young people in pursuing this. So what I'll now do is to say just a little more about the approach in its relationship to other alternative approaches, and then I'm going to say a few words about the very delicate question of cultural relativism and universalism. So, why capabilities? Well, we've already seen some reasons why GDP alone doesn't tell us enough. It fails to look at questions of distribution. It fails to disaggregate and separately pursue different aspects of a human life. But one step up in adequacy, we have approaches that are based on utility, which measure the quality of life by looking at the satisfaction of preferences and viewing the aim as that of maximizing satisfaction. This approach, of course, is much better because it focuses on the experience of people. And it's about people rather than about some stuff sitting there somewhere in the state. And I actually think that if you make enough refinements in this approach, and I talked about this in the law philosophy workshop yesterday, you can make it adequate. I won't try to do that here. I might in the question period if you press me. But I actually think that John Stuart Mill already was ahead of the game and made a lot of the corrections in utilitarianism that would make it adequate. But I'm just going to address the crude versions of it that are used by development economists. And I'm going to say why those versions are not adequate. Well, first of all, like the GDP approach, it neglects distribution. The satisfactions of different people are just funneled together to promote total or average utility, and that notoriously can give you a result where the best total or average is produced by a structure that deprives very severely some people at the bottom. So that's already a problem if you think that any approach focused on social justice should focus particularly keenly on the situation of people at the bottom. Second, again, like the GDP approach, it aggregates and doesn't separately consider the different aspects of human life. So bodily integrity, political participation, health, and so on, all are viewed as sources of a single thing satisfaction, and their separateness is really not attended to. And of course, this was something that Bentham already introduced in the 18th century when he founded utilitarianism as a simplifying device. But that simplicity is initially perhaps clarifying, but in the end it can obscure the important separateness of these different aspects of human life. Third, utilitarianism, by focusing on the satisfaction of preferences, it neglects a phenomenon that economists have increasingly talked about, and that is called the phenomenon of adaptive preferences. People adjust their satisfactions to what they think they can actually achieve. And it's well known by now empirically that even in the area of physical health, people can get used to the way they feel. You know, if they think a woman should feel weak, well, then they're satisfied with feeling weak because they don't know that if they were to be better nourished, they would feel quite differently. So that the satisfactions that people actually report are extremely malleable, and they're likely to be hijacked by an unjust status quo. So that if women report that they're satisfied with the level of education that they've actually received, not clear that we should chart our course by that answer, because that might just be because it's been dinned into them from the very beginning that a good woman doesn't get educated, and they're not aware of the opportunities that would be open to them by education and of the various ways in which education could transform their life. And then finally, utilitarianism, typically by focusing on the state of satisfaction, doesn't give enough weight to the importance of agency. People don't just want to feel satisfied. And in fact, they might be much happier feeling dissatisfied if they were active agents in their struggle. So that when you think about what kind of food policy, what kind of family policy you want to have, to focus only on satisfaction is to neglect the fact that people want to have a hand. They want to be choice makers in the policies that govern their lives. So those are things that are wrong with the utilitarian view. Now, one step further up, you might have an approach that focuses on resources and says that justice is best promoted by distributing to all some basic all-purpose resources such as income and wealth. And of course that's much better because we're talking now about distribution, and we're talking about giving everyone something that they can use to make choices and shape their own lives. But there's still some problems, because although income and wealth are good things to have, they're not really good proxies for all the diverse aspects of development. It's just not the case that you can solve problems of domestic violence or lack of public schools and so on by giving people a certain amount of money. It just can't change the institutional structure sufficiently. And moreover, as Sen has stressed, depending on your starting point, you need different amounts of resources to come up to the same level of actual ability to function. An example that he famously used was a person who uses a wheelchair needs to have more spent on them in connection with their mobility than a person who has so-called normal mobility, because of course society is already designed for the needs of the second person and not of the first person. So in order to make the changes that would make mobility possible for the first person, we need to spend more money for that person than for the so-called normal person. So in short, background conditions are unequal. Certain people start from a marginalized position, and therefore there are good reasons to spend more on those people, and so that needs to be factored in. And the best way to do that is to think, what would it take to equalize the actual level of opportunity for functioning? So taking stock of all these problems, the capabilities approach instead says, well, what are people actually able to do and to be? And the answer to that question is the set of capabilities or substantive opportunities that people actually have. Now, what I've tried to do with the list that you have in front of you is to use this not just as a comparative measure of quality of life. That's how it's used in the Sarkozy Commission and in the UN reports, but as the building block of a normative theory of social justice. And what I say is, let's focus on these 10 capabilities and say that a nation has only secured meaningful justice to its people in case all 10 are secured to them up to a certain threshold level, which would then need to be specified. So the central capabilities are closely linked to the idea of rights. They include an idea of entitlement, but rights could be understood in a thin way. That is, rights are secure just in case the state does nothing or keeps its hands off. My capabilities all are, as it were, positive entitlements. That is, the duty of the government is to secure them by some form of government action. So then you can study the list, and I'd be happy to talk about why the list has got those 10 items and so on. It's very important that the items are separate. That is, just as in the Bill of Rights, we know that these are separate rights. You can't satisfy one of them by just giving people a very large amount of another one. People have the right to freedom of speech, and giving them an especially large amount of freedom of religion doesn't atone for deficiencies in the speech area. So too with all of my capabilities. You can't atone for a deficiency in one area by just giving people a very large amount of another one. But of course, they do reinforce and support each other, so you ought to think of them as an interlocking set. One of the best ways actually to promote women's employment opportunities and their ability to exit from an abusive or violent relationship is to promote basic education. It's pretty obvious, because that's the source of employment opportunities, and employment opportunities translates into exit. So, once again, important research by my colleague Beena Agarwal, the head of the Institute for Economic Growth in India, shows that actually land rights are another very important source of exit and employment opportunity for women. And in some regions, more important than education, because having land ownership in her own name, a woman has a very important asset, and if she leaves the family, she can take that away, and so that gives her a kind of claim to be treated better in her family. So in short, it's important to study the interrelationships. But the basic intuition from which the philosophical aspect of the approach begins is that human abilities exert a moral claim that they should be developed. Adam Smith, observing the children in England who got no education but were sent straight to work in the factories, said that their human powers had been mutilated and deformed. In other words, they never got a chance to unfold themselves as human beings because they were forced into a situation where they couldn't think or unfold their minds, contemplate the political issues of their day, and so they just had to do this monotonous factory labor the whole time. And he contrasted the poor children of Scotland who, even though they're very poor, they had primary education provided at low cost. It wasn't completely cost-free, but it should have been, he thought. And they then, even though later they might work at a very demanding job, they had a head start because their human abilities had unfolded. So that's basically the sort of intuition that I'm working with. But let's go back now to Vasanti and see how the lens of the capabilities approach does illuminate her situation. Now, one thing to notice is that going in, Vasanti had very few capabilities of any kind, very little freedom, because the script of her life had been pretty much entirely written by men. Her father, who married her, her husband, who controlled her life, the brothers who received her kindly, but then kept her as a poor dependent. So this dependency put her at risk with respect to life and health. It denied her an education that would have developed her powers of thought and perception, and it prevented her from thinking of herself as a person who had a plan of life of her own to shape and choices to make. In the marriage, she did worst of all because she lost her bodily integrity to domestic violence, her emotional equanimity to fear, and she was just totally cut off from meaningful forms of affiliation, familial, civic, political. I mean, she couldn't go out of the house. Like many upper caste women in a bad marriage, one of the worst aspects of it was just to be totally confined to the house. So she really didn't have the conception of herself as a free being whose worth is equal to that of others. The save alone changed that picture. She now had not only an income, but also independent control over her livelihood. Even when she still owed a lot of money, it was a lot better to owe it to a group of women who are fostering values of equality and self-respect than to owe it to your brothers. And she became, right away, part of a mutually supportive network, and she developed relationships such as she had never known. And that was what she told me, one of the most remarkable surprises for her of this situation, that she formed friendships based on equality. She came in to talk to me with a lower caste woman that in her earlier life she never would have been permitted to talk to. I mean, she was a Brahmin. This woman was probably a Dalit. I never really found it out for sure. But in any case, this was a friendship based on equality across lines of caste. And these two women had decided that what they were going to do with their leisure time was to organize women in their neighborhood to fight domestic violence and to try to provide shelters from domestic violence. So she was politically active in a way that she never was before, and her sense of her dignity increased. Reflecting on her situation, I think one of the things we have to notice right away is that the choices made by the state of Gujarat did nothing for her. And she was just very lucky that one of the best non-governmental organizations in the world was right in her backyard. Gujarat, as I say, has pursued a foreign investment growth-based agenda. The results of that growth do not reach the rural poor, and they do not reach women, urban or rural. Government failed to assure her an education. It failed to give her easy access to divorce. She had to struggle and pay a lawyer for about 10 years. It failed to give her any protection from domestic violence, no women's shelters virtually in the whole state. And in fact, the only role that government played markedly in her life was a negative one. Remember the cash payment for the vasectomy that the husband got, and that made her insecure and vulnerable situation much more vulnerable. So we can see, though, that the pertinent features of her situation are much more fully opened up for diagnosis and eventual treatment by the capabilities list than by the rivals. And I think this diagnostic and remedial value derives directly from the fact that the approach is interdisciplinary in the way that it is. Economists have been working with philosophers, and they've been working with people from gender studies, and all of this is informed by a close study of regional and national history. And in fact, one reason that I've always focused on India, besides just a sheer love of India, is that I think you can't implement this approach in any meaningful way without knowing the context extremely well and its different regional differences. But what about the fact that obviously we're recommending some kind of universal approach to nations and regions of very different kinds? And well, it helps to assuage the worry that the primary members of this team, or at least the ones who started it, come from the South and are from the formerly colonized nations. So the worry about whether this is a covert form of imperialism is partly assuaged by that, but still it doesn't really remove the worry about universalism. Wouldn't any prescription for all these different nations be almost certain to be too dictatorial, or perhaps even a kind of outside imposition? So, you know, from the very beginning of my work on the approach, I've been very worried about that kind of critique, and I've therefore tried to answer it and to build a sensitivity to cultural difference into the approach in many ways. First, the list is just a set of suggestions. I think you have to start somewhere, but it's only by throwing something out that you get criticisms that help you remake it. And so that's the spirit in which it's offered. It's subject to ongoing revision and rethinking, and very much in the way that any country's first take about its constitutional entitlements will always be subject to debate. Second, I also insist that these very abstract items on the list need to be specified in a concrete way by each country taking its own history and its own particular circumstances into account. Within certain parameters, it's perfectly right that different countries should do this differently. For example, a free speech right that suits Germany quite well, which forbids the dissemination or even Xeroxing of all anti-Semitic materials and the organizing of all anti-Semitic groups, seems too restrictive for the different history and climate of the United States. And I think what I would want to say is that both nations are correct in making the different choices that correspond to different histories. Third point is that I think of this list as a list for political purposes, which can be the point of convergence among people who otherwise have very different overall ideas of what a worthwhile human life is. Here I borrow a page from John Rawls, his idea of political liberalism, where he says that the political principles for a country that contains different religions, different secular conceptions of the good life, must be as it were, thin and not articulated in terms of ideas that belong to one dominant religion or dominant secular view rather than another. So they must not contain ideas, let's say, for example, ideas of the human soul or the immortal soul or something, that would divide people along lines of religion and comprehensive view. So there are notions there, such as the notion of human dignity, that just will be understood in different ways by different people, given their different religious and other views of human life. But all can agree. And I think that has happened in the modern human rights movement. The people have agreed to endorse certain ideas of human rights and human dignity without agreeing at all about the deeper metaphysical grounding of that. Fourth point is that notice that the political goal is specified as securing capabilities, not actual functioning. Give people options, then the choice whether to pursue it or not is left entirely to them. And so I think that's very important, because a right to vote could be endorsed by a member of the old order Amish who thinks that it's always wrong to participate in politics. But they could support the existence of that capability for all citizens. They're just not going to use it. Again, religious freedom can be endorsed by people who think that all religion is bad and even destructive. They're not going to use it, but they think they can. I think most such people do think that it's good for a country to have it. And so even at the level of physical health, that's true. That is to say, making adequate health care available gives you the option. If you then choose to lead an unhealthy life, well, that's your choice. There's a huge difference between being ill-nourished because that's the only choice you have, and being ill-nourished because you choose to fast or to, in other ways, lead an unhealthy life. Final point is that I insist on a very strong separation between issues of justification and issues of implementation. I think that it's one thing to have an international debate and to come to some agreement that these are good things for people in all nations to have, but what happens next? Well, what happens next is a nation then decides, do we want to put that into our Constitution or not? And I just hope they will. But going beyond that to any kind of intervention in the affairs of another sovereign nation, I actually am quite strongly opposed to. And I think that any kind of humanitarian intervention to secure human rights should be undertaken, if at all, only in the gravest possible circumstances of genocide or gross crimes against humanity. So that means that the idea behind the charge of imperialism, I think, is the idea that, well, if we decide that India hasn't done enough, then we'll bring our troops in and make them protect the capabilities. And that is not my idea at all. The idea is this is an argument. And if you don't agree with the argument, well, then do something else. But in any case, we try to persuade you. So let me now go back, in conclusion, to Vasanti, this very determined and I think very eloquent woman who showed up that one afternoon to meet me in the office of Seva. What she said to me in conclusion was, women in India have a lot of hardship, but out of our suffering, our strength is born. And she says, now I feel that I'm actually a stronger person because I can now use my life to give some help to other people. Well, the struggle for opportunity, for capability, is one that's being waged by many deprived people all over the world. Many, disgracefully, are in rich and developed countries. I think the U.S. should hang its head in shame at the notorious fact that the health status of inner-city New Yorkers in Harlem is just slightly less robust than the average in Kerala, one of the poorest states in quite a poor nation, but one that happens to care about health care. And once again, I think we should hang our head in shame at the fact that the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that 18% of U.S. women have experienced rape or attempted rape, usually from an intimate partner, and the rate of physical violence is approximately double that. Well, we don't have good data about domestic violence in our country or in the world as a whole, but underreporting is probably much more likely to be the norm than overreporting. So all nations have a lot of work to do if they want to secure the capabilities of all their people, even those 10 that are on my list. India has made some heroic strides in recent years to address some problems that face all nations. So one question is how nations can help one another out in fighting the struggle for human capabilities. One way, surely, is financial aid. And I do believe that the richer nations of the world owe a great deal more than they currently give to poor nations in connection with economic and educational development. Norway currently gives close to 2% of GDP, and that should be, I think, a minimum norm for all nations. But another aid in this struggle is good intellectual work. Theories influence the way things happen. The old development theories were used by the IMF and the World Bank. They affected the way aid was doled out, the way data were gathered. I mean, for example, you couldn't even get data about how women were doing because all the data was about households, and they didn't disaggregate it. In many ways, they deflected attention from the struggles of the most deprived. The capabilities approach is not exactly telling Vasanti anything that by now she doesn't know after her education in Seva, but it's able to go to bat in the corridors of power to combat the defective theoretical approaches, and in that way serving as a kind of ally of the poor and the excluded, a kind of advocate arguing their case. Well, people are what matter, as Mahbub al-Haq said, and ideas matter only because people matter, but ideas do matter for people, and I think that this is one thing that in a great law school, which does have human rights internship programs and other programs that reach out to the rest of the world, you could all be thinking about, because I think we all need to put our heads together across boundaries of country, discipline, that divide us if the world's most pressing problems of exclusion and inequality are to be solved. Thanks. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm an economics student, I'm a PhD student, and I want to ask you a question about your statement about education and health and other political outcomes not being correlated with growth. Mm-hmm. As far as I see it, I agree that growth is not a sufficient condition to achieve all these other social outcomes, but is it appropriate to view growth as a necessary condition? We do observe, if we compare around the world, that the richer nations are better equipped and are more successful at promoting these goals and human capabilities in general. So I would worry that your approach would undermine the policies that are promoting growth.
Well, I think growth is a positive contributor. I wouldn't go so far as to say necessary, because Kerala, as I point out, Kerala was controlled by a Marxist government for most of its history, and its economy kind of collapsed because the unions were allowed to drive up wages so high that the labor market fled to adjacent states, and often men went to the Gulf to work. So they didn't have any economic growth. They had negative growth, and they still had these great achievements in education and health. So necessary, I wouldn't go so far. But I think the data do suggest that on balance, it's a very good thing to shoot for, sure. Whether to shoot for it in the form of encouraging a lot of foreign investment, that's a separate question. One of the problems you get into there is if you do that without first having prepared the ground by having good education and health policies, then the people in your own state won't be equipped to take the jobs in the firm that you've invited in. This has happened in West Bengal, where they invited a chemical factory in, and then they say to these peasants, well, sorry, now just get off your land. Well, it would have been one thing if the peasants were invited to move from subsistence agriculture to work in the chemical plant. But because they had no schooling, I mean, 20% of the teachers in West Bengal on any given day do not show up in the classroom. So the education system is such a dismal failure, particularly in rural areas, that those individuals could not take the jobs that were being created, and therefore they quite sensibly didn't want to get off their land, and a huge conflict ensued in which the communist government of West Bengal was shooting rural peasants in the back. It was quite an amazing thing. So disgraceful thing, in fact. And so I think, you know, good growth has to go hand in hand in this situation with education, because otherwise, who are you helping? You're not helping your people. You're going to help some group of foreign workers who will come in, but it won't be your own people who will get help. So there are good ways of doing this, and there are bad ways of doing this. And I think one of the nice things about studying the Indian states, because the Constitution has left health and education to be managed by the states and not by the central government, is that it is like a laboratory where you can see how different combinations of economic policy and education health policy have led to different results. And yeah, I mean, the conclusion that I would draw, and that Sen himself also draws, is that we should reject the old kind of leftist approaches that say economic growth is not important. We should insist that it's very important. But we should also insist that it's not the only thing that's important, and indeed you can't reap the fruits of it without paying attention to those other things. Yes?
I was just curious. You started off by mentioning that it's an ongoing project and that you're still working on it. And the last thing I read about you was Frontiers of Justice. So I was curious if maybe you could outline a few more recent developments that you've been working on with regards to this list.
Okay, great. Well, the first thing to say is that I got much more deeply into the Indian aspect of it. Because one thing that I think nicely happens when you focus on a country, and I focused on India simply for theoretical reasons, that I wanted to have an approach that was grounded and that you could show how it would play out in a very concrete situation. But then, being there and being involved in the conflicts, I got asked and urged to write for Americans about things that were going on in India. So I wrote a book about the Hindu right and its assault on religious liberty, and that came out in 2007. So that was, you know, connected with the capabilities approach, to be sure, but it was a kind of spin-off project. But then the other thing I did, since I think that each of the capabilities really deserves a book, or perhaps many books, because you want to show, first of all, what the structure of that capability would be, but then you want to show that for a given country, and it might be subtly different in other countries. So I wrote a book in 2008 called Liberty of Conscience, which was about religious liberty and non-establishment in the United States tradition, but with a lot of reflections on how this might play out in other nations. And of course, my India work always looking over my shoulder. And so I feel like that's an example of what it might be. And I was challenged by an excellent philosopher, Henry Richardson, who gave a plenary address to our annual meeting, saying that, look, it's not enough to just list these liberties, but you have to show how they form an integrated system, what it would be to implement them. So I thought I was taking on that challenge for the case of just one liberty. I'm not going to just march through them all sequentially, but I thought that exercise was very, very helpful. What I'm doing now, well, okay, so then the next thing that happened is two young philosophers wrote a wonderful book called Disadvantage. One of them is Jonathan Wolfe from University College London. The other is Avner de Shalit from Israel. And it was a book based on empirical studies of immigrant groups in their two countries, which they had talked with these groups about my capabilities list, gotten their reactions to it. So it had an empirical aspect, but it also had, and I think more importantly, a theoretical aspect, where they made various suggestions for modifying and expanding the approach, which I thought, I mean, of course, a lot of things are written, and only some of them are really first-rate, but this was really first-rate, and it really made me want to sit up and take notice. They said, first of all, you want to specify not just capability, but capability security. So you want to develop a concept of capabilities as guaranteed over time. Because one of the things they found in their immigrant populations, not surprisingly, they didn't know what the case would be tomorrow, you know, and they wanted a sense of security. So that was one thing that they added. And then they had these two concepts that I thought were very valuable. One was fertile functioning, and the other is corrosive disadvantage. Fertile functioning, and of course they did it for alliterative purposes, but I think they should have said fertile capability, is a capability that when you secure it is particularly valuable in opening up others. Now, I already said that education was like that, but you know, just thinking about that conceptually is actually very clarifying. And a corrosive disadvantage, by the same token, is a disadvantage that has the consequence of eating away at all the others. And so those were the suggestions they made. They also made other more concrete suggestions, like access to instruction in the majority language was one of the things their immigrant groups particularly needed and didn't have. And so anyhow, I wrote about that book, and I really built it into what I'm doing now. So what I'm doing now is this overview, but it's not just an overview. It's actually a rethinking, and it has all these new wrinkles in it and all kinds of things that people have brought to my attention. And therefore, it's proven. I mean, I thought initially it might just be a chore to write something that could be used in undergraduate teaching was the task. But it's actually proven to be extremely exhilarating because I rethink everything. What I'll do after that, I've got this project underway that's been underway for some time, thinking about how to bring my work, my long-term work on emotions, together with the work on capabilities by thinking about the way in which public cultivation of emotions can affect the stability of a society that's built on the idea of human capability. My great editor, Terry Moore from Cambridge University Press, said, why don't you write a book called Compassion and Capabilities, bringing these two sides of yourself together. And he died shortly after that and so on. But anyway, I did think that was a challenge that I want to meet. And think about the various ways in which, by public symbol, ceremony, but also by educational strategies, countries do nourish a kind of emotional attachment to good principles and thereby underwrite the stability. So I've been thinking a lot about good and bad forms of patriotism and nationalism and all of that. So that's the current work. Yes?
I have a question about the limits on, or how they want to limit human capabilities. So, for example, you mentioned the choice of unhealthy and also high rates of sexual abuse. And insofar as unhealthy choices might lead to such abuse, how would you think about limiting all these sort of positive capabilities by external things like duty and shame coming from outside the person?
Well, I think what I'm thinking about here is the job of government. And I think the job of government stops when you feel that a full-fledged choice is available to people. Now, when that point is reached, it's of course very hard to know. And I think you do have to think about family pressures and community pressures in thinking about that question. So you certainly want children to feel that they have a choice to leave their community, and you want them not just to feel that, but you want them to have employment options that make that choice possible. But beyond that, I guess I think it's a different question what to do about people who make bad choices, and who might do so because even of adaptive preferences. If women choose abusive relationships, well, I'm not prepared to say that people never choose that. I think what a good state should do is make available plenty of exit options, plenty of education about your worth and dignity, and plenty of economic support so that you don't have to be stuck there because you can't get a job, and plenty of shelters and so on. But as to whether you go and rescue somebody forcibly from that situation, I wouldn't myself go that far, even though, of course, capabilities are at risk. But see, so that's where in my own version of the implementation of the approach, I'm at the libertarian end of it. There are people who think that with respect to health, bodily integrity, and so on, the state is entitled to promote healthy functioning, by just penalizing people who lead an unhealthy lifestyle and so on. And so within the group of people who are working on the approach, there are different positions. But my position is more that what we have to think about is what is meaningful choice. Once that point is there, well, then the other mechanisms that shape a human life, such as you say, honor and shame, we should not try to interfere with those. Now, of course, I think that shame is often used publicly in ways that are bad and deforming. And actually, I wrote a book on discussed shame in the law in order to talk about things like punishments based on shaming, why that's a bad thing, and so on. So it's not like shame doesn't have a public face that I'm concerned with, but I also think it has a non-public face, and that up to a point, we really don't want to interfere with its operations so long as sufficient work has been done in all these different areas of human life to guarantee meaningful choice. Yeah?
What data not currently collected or collected well would lead to a better implementation of the capabilities approach in countries around the world?
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Well, we just need to know more about what goes on in the household. And I fear that Gary Becker's great work on the family has actually been an impediment here, because in his treatise on the family, he made the assumption that the head of the household is a beneficent altruist who will take care adequately for internal distributions. Everyone was influenced by that. And of course, it was an enormously valuable work. It put the family on the agenda of economics, so it was a great book. But it had this one feature that was rather unfortunate, because actually heads of households, mostly male, are not beneficent altruists. And when little girls are starving or are not taken to the doctor when they're sick, all these very familiar phenomena of developing country life, it's because the head of the household has decreed that some lives are more worth saving than others. Now, of course, it might actually be the mother who implements this, but it's not without the collaboration of the husband. So we need a lot more information about different family members, and some of the data about sex ratios in morbidity and mortality have to be based on very indirect things, like the sex ratio in the nation. And that's not really good enough, all the more since the census is notoriously prone to inaccuracies. I mean, the sex ratio that demographers expect, if women and men are given equal nutrition and health care, is 102 women to 100 men. In India, the latest census gives 92 women to 100 men. So we know there's a lot of something happening to women, and it's some combination of differential nutrition, differential health care, some infanticide, but more often now sex-selective abortion, because at least we do have the natality ratio, so we can pick up on that. But what actually it is, you see, we don't know, and we don't even know if these numbers are accurate. And a group that I worked with in Bihar did a house-to-house count and found 75 women to 100 men. So, you know, that's very different from the state data, but Bihar is a notoriously corrupt state. So we need better data, and particularly data about the household, I would say. And then just in every region, we need data that are independently gathered by responsible agencies and that don't depend on the corrupt procedures of states that usually want to make themselves look good and win re-election. Yeah.
It seems like a system that endorses a list of incommensurate rights might not serve as a particularly good guide to state action in a world with limited resources. I mean, if you only have enough money to build either a school or a hospital, but not both, the state's going to have to self-consciously value either senses, imagination, and thought, or bodily integrity, and sacrifice one for the other. How can the capabilities approach conceptually deal with that sort of thing?
Yeah, of course, that's a very big question that comes up prominently in this approach. And actually, I just, if you really want to read something about it, there's a volume that my colleague Eric Posner edited with Matt Adler called Cost-Benefit Analysis. It came from an issue of the Journal of Legal Studies, so it's in there too. And I have an article called The Costs of Tragedy, where I really address this in detail. But briefly, I think what you first want to say is, where you do have that situation, assuming you really have to make that terrible choice, then you know that you're in a tragic situation where full justice is not being done. And it's important to acknowledge that, to say, well, we are not in the position yet of being a minimally just society, because we can't deliver both of these important goods up to a minimal threshold level. Now, that's not just piteous hand-wringing, I think, because it can motivate you to think ahead and to design things in a better way. So then and this is what Hegel said about the value of tragedy, right? You think, how did I get into this predicament where I can't do justice to both of these values? And then you might look around and you might notice that someone else thought more creatively and didn't get into that pickle. And I think this does happen in India in the following sense. A lot of parents face a terrible choice between sending their children to school and getting enough to eat, because if they don't send the children out to work, they don't get enough to eat. Well, but then we notice that Kerala, an unusually poor state, has actually got 99% literacy, and the people are in pretty good health. How did it do that? And this is the question the Supreme Court of India asked when it was about to interpret the new constitutional right to education. The way they did it was multi-session school days, so that working children could go at various different times, plus a nutritious midday meal served in the school that would be like a carrot to the poor parents to send the child to school. The Supreme Court of India ordered all schools in India to serve a midday meal that had at least 350 calories and 18 grams of protein. That's judicial activism for you. But anyway, so the claim is that's the way to cut through this tragedy. We see a path that has cut its way through, and so we know that this is not inevitability of life. And I think we usually should think that way. Now, of course, goals should not be set unrealistically, given where we are. So if we said, well, the minimum of education is that all people should have postgraduate degrees, and we were trying to shoot for that right away, starting from a position of great poverty, that might be too utopian. It might be a recipe for hand-wringing that wouldn't be very productive. So I think you have to set the goals realistically, and what India has done is to make a constitutional entitlement of primary and secondary education cost-free, and then implement it in a creative and thoughtful way. And and then if you can't do that, you better ask for help from outside. So that's the next part. I mean, so if you're really not corrupt and you've thought very well and you're just plain poor, then I think that's the situation where it's the duty of the richer nations to help you out. But then they better do it, once again, in a creative way. They're not just throwing some cash around, but thinking, what are the programs that would really be helpful here? And, in your case, where you have to build either a school or a hospital, I mean, once again, I don't think that such choices ever occur in exactly that form, because good schooling costs next to nothing. Some of the best education that I've ever seen in India is provided by NGOs who, they're supported themselves by some grants from usually Sweden or the Netherlands, but they don't have much money, and they use no resources. They sit on the ground, they use a slate, but it's the passion and the commitment of the teachers that drives the education, and it's much better than what's happening in most government schools. So I think the school could be done on the cheap so long as you have people with passion. The hospital obviously needs a lot more money and equipment. So that would be the way I would approach that particular one in the short run. Yes?
So this is kind of on a related point. I'm wondering to what extent you have a theory about intergenerational capabilities. So it's the question of, should we spend money giving people capabilities today or invest in things that we think will develop capabilities for their children in the future?
That's one of the big things that I think remains to be worked on for the future. And, in Frontiers of Justice, I said Rawls mentioned 4 areas that his theory had not dealt with yet, and I was going to address 3 of them. And the one I didn't address was actually justice for future generations, partly because I thought he did pretty well on that one with a just savings principle. And so I do think that that's a good starting point if you want to think about that. But I also think that it's going to have to involve thinking about environment in a way that I'm not yet equipped to do. And therefore, one thing is I'm going to do a lot more teaching with my colleagues and thinking about this with people who do work on that kind of thing, like David Weisbach and others. But, that's why we have an association, that people who are expert in different areas should work out. And I've had graduate students who are off teaching now who are working on capabilities and environment. So I think that's a collaborative project, and it's not one that I feel I can do alone, because it does involve technical issues about discounting and so on. But it's very, very important. Now, I do think that a society shouldn't be able to get off the hook very easily, because I do think most societies, well and honestly run, can deliver the capabilities up to some reasonable threshold. That's why Kerala is a good example, because it's not actually all that well run in some respects, but even then, it somehow managed to deliver the goods in important areas while still being quite poor. And so it gives people less excuse. They can't pass the buck to the next generation quite so easily. So I think that's very important. And, I guess in the case of India, I feel like so much is deferred. Basic justice. I mean, a woman who wants to file a rape complaint will have to wait 10 years before her case gets to court. So I would, in practical terms, I would put the onus on the government to do something about it here and now. Yes?
To what extent do these capabilities correlate with or trade off with just a conception of happiness. For example, bodily health we touched on earlier. There are a lot, like soda might make someone very happy, but it also, too much of it might harm a society's health standard. To what extent do these capabilities trade off?
Well, I think it depends what one means by happiness. The new research on happiness is not terribly clear about that, because sometimes they seem to be talking about a feeling of pleasure, which is what Bentham meant by happiness. Sometimes they mean something much more nebulous, like the feeling of satisfaction with your life as a whole. And when they ask questions like, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? Even that question is ambiguous, because is it asking, do you have a feeling of satisfaction? Or is it asking, do you on reflection judge that your life as a whole has been successful? We had a conference on happiness a couple of years ago here. There's an issue of the Journal of Legal Studies devoted to that, where some of us have weighed in with some critical judgments. But think about John Stuart Mill on his deathbed. Now, he was in a lot of pain. He also knew, as he states, that he would not, because he didn't believe in an afterlife, that he would never be reunited with Harriet, which was something he passionately desired, his wife, who had died before him. And so he was unhappy in this sense of not feeling satisfied or pleased. On the other hand, his last words were, I have done my work. And I think those words express a judgment that his life as a whole had been a success in some sense. And so, which one are they asking about? So if you thinking about, was Mill judging that he was satisfied with his life as a whole? I think the answer is yes. But was he feeling pleased or satisfied? No. So I think these questions are profoundly ambiguous. And once we clear it up, then we can start posing questions. And I think Mill's own conception of happiness, which is one which involves a lot of different kinds of activities managed by your own choice, but also feelings of delight. That's a good conception of happiness, because I think it's important to include feelings of delight. This is something that Aristotle didn't do. So I think it kind of makes the best combination between Bentham and Aristotle by emphasizing both lots of activity and lots of choice and feelings of delight. So I like that conception of happiness, and I think that's an important one to shoot for. But so anyway, it just depends what we think we're talking about. I'm afraid that our time is up, but thanks very much. And ask me any other questions by email.